Good afternoon, everyone. I promise this is the last time you'll hear from me during this conference. The title of my talk is Do Official Language Minority Communities Impact Immigrant Retention? Originally, Jacob Travis was supposed to come here from Ottawa to present. He was unable to make it, and he sends his apologies, so that's why I'm here. I wasn't planning to present this, but it's fine. One other point, you'll notice that there have been a couple of other, if you compare the list of authors that I have here now to what is in the program, you'll notice that there are 2 new people that have been added, and the reason is that people keep quitting. So the list keeps growing, and I hope this is a final list and that it won't continue to grow, but one never knows. So these are some new people, some students that I'm working with. Okay, so there are 3 research questions, and I should say at the outset as well, this research was funded by CIC, and we are deeply indebted to the discussions that we've had with people from CIC, particularly Cedric and Marie, but at the same time, the opinions expressed here do not represent those of the agency. Well done, I said. Okay, so we have 3 research questions. The ones in red are the 2 that we'll have a chance to look at today in greater detail. The first one is how many Francophone communities are there outside of Quebec, and we're calling these OLMCs. How many Anglophone communities are there within Quebec, and again, we're calling these OLMCs as well. The second question is looking at where Anglophone and Francophone immigrants settle. This is a fascinating question, and I think Lorraine talked a little bit about it in her presentation, which is great because I won't have time to address that today. And then third, what are the individual and community level characteristics that predict retention? So if you think about immigrants moving around all the time within Canada, as they do, one of the main drivers of this research is identifying the extent to which community-level characteristics act as a magnet. So if you are a Francophone immigrant and you settle in a remote part of Canada where there are no other French speakers, how much more likely are you to leave that area to head to a region where people speak your language? That's the main driver here. Why is this an interesting question? Well, there are various reasons of why it's an interesting question. The Government of Canada certainly seems to be interested in the answer to this question. It's issued a couple of fairly significant publications over the past few years that looks at and identifies the importance of official language minority communities, and it has underscored multiple times its intention to continue to dedicate resources to bolstering these communities and ensuring that they live on in perpetuity. So it's important at a national level, and as an Atlantic Canadian, it's also important because we have an awful lot of OLMCs, and these often happen to be regions where we have fairly significant rates of out-migration of the domestic population, the Canadian-born population. So one of the obvious questions is, to what extent can we depend on immigration to sort of fill the gaps and continue to ensure the vitality of these places? Now, having said that, Cedric, Anne-Marie, and I have had lots of discussions, interesting ones, around trying to define what exactly an official language minority community is. And, you know, it's one of those things that I believe you kind of know what it is, but it's really hard to pinpoint a definition. So there was one CIC publication from 2006 that defined a Francophone community as regions that contain Francophones living in provinces and territories other than Quebec. And additionally, as by implication, that would also include Anglophones living in Quebec. So if you're an Anglophone living in Quebec, you are part of an Anglophone minority community, vice versa for the rest of Canada. But that's fairly broad. There isn't a lot of differentiation then, because what it sort of suggests is that the community sort of follows an individual around. And if this person happens to be a truck driver, then it's sort of a mobile official language minority community. So what we tried to do is pinpoint a little bit anyway, a definition that was more rigid and isolated through time. So what we did, and this is admittedly somewhat arbitrary, and I'll explain why we chose this. We identified OLMCs as any jurisdiction that has 10% of the population, or 1,000 people, that speaks French in the rest of Canada or English within Quebec. And community is defined at the census subdivision level, and this is purely practical. We defined it at CSD level for purely practical reasons, and CSDs correspond to municipalities most of the time. The reason we chose this 10% or 1,000 threshold is that we wanted to ensure that every province had a chance. Every province has an OLMC, so therefore it is eligible for the federal funds that are being used to ensure that OLMCs remain vital, et cetera, and at the same time, it also demonstrates how widespread OLMCs are across Canada. So, employing this definition, we get a table that looks something like this. This comes from the these data come from the census, and we used 4 censuses for this analysis, as well as the IMDb, which I'll talk about in a moment. And what we have is a count of the number of OLMCs at 4 different points in time. So in 1990, Newfoundland had 10 OLMCs, and that remains constant over time. PEI somehow managed to double the number of OLMCs, and this is probably people acquiring French over time. And I can go through all of them. But as you see, there's quite a bit of movement in identifying OLMCs, even with this definition that we had. So not only is defining an OLMC difficult, but this project was further hampered by trying to define an Anglophone Francophone. What we settled on for now, and this may well change because we were in constant discussions with Cedric and Anne-Marie and other people at CIC, so far what we have is the ability to speak French in the rest of Canada or English in Quebec qualifies you as an Anglophone or a Francophone. This is probably admittedly contentious, but we had to settle on some sort of definition. The alternative, or one of the alternatives that we entertained, was using the first official language spoken criteria that has been used in the past, in multiple publications. I believe Lorraine talked about it briefly as well, where one official language, 5 minutes? Really? Okay. One official, okay. So that's the definition we didn't use. I'm going to move along. Data sources. At the individual level, what we do is we take individual level data and we link it to community level data. The individual level data comes from the IMDb, so this longitudinal immigrant data bank again. We look at 4 arrival cohorts and we track them over a 5-year period. 1990, 95, 2000, and 2005. The community level is again census information, so we collapse census data down to the census subdivision level and we attach it to individual records and we look at the extent to which the characteristics of a community impact retention. We use a bunch of analytical techniques that I won't have time to talk to you about. Main findings, I'll scoot along to the main findings. At the individual level, so I'll present individual level and then community level findings. At the individual level, I don't think there's a lot here that will surprise anyone in the room. Outmigration from a province, from an OLMC, declines with age. Married immigrants are more likely to stay put. This is true across the board. So for smaller jurisdictions that are looking to increase retention, go after married immigrants, particularly ones with kids. Highly educated people are more mobile. This is true the world over. Refugees, this might be a function of the settlement process, the allocation process. They have higher outmigration rates. Family class, lower outmigration rates. And this is often, I think, because family class is joining people, members of their family that are already here. Francophone immigrants have higher retention rates in Quebec. Anglophone immigrants have higher retention rates in the rest of Canada. Now, this is where it gets interesting to me. High home ownership communities, so areas where a lot of people own their homes. It's a magnet. Higher retention rates. This might be due to differences in neighborhood quality. It might be due to the fact that people are invested and therefore less mobile once they buy a home in these high home ownership areas. High human capital communities also have higher retention rates. In Quebec, OLMCs help retain all immigrants, not just Anglophone immigrants, all immigrants. In fact, there is little additional effect on retention for Anglophones. So in other words, these OLMCs are magnets not just for Anglophones, but for everyone. So for the statisticians in the room, the OLMC Anglophone interaction term was not statistically significant. In the rest of Canada, the same is happening in the other direction. OLMCs have higher retention rates for all immigrants, not just Francophone immigrants. So what this suggests, and we have to look at this in more detail, I think, but what this suggests is that there's no additional pull or retention mechanism for Francophone immigrants. There's an overall OLMC effect. So research can go in lots of different directions. Some of the thoughts that I had, that we had, 4 of us now, is that obviously immigration is a critical part of OLMCs. How critical? So to what extent are OLMCs facing extinction due to outmigration of the population that ordinarily resides there or has traditionally resided there? Will immigration actually stop that gap? Second, to what extent are OLMC, non-OLMC disparities in retention due to selectivity? So do you move to an OLMC, like it there, and decide to stay? Or did you choose an OLMC in the first place because you saw language as important, and not surprisingly, you're more likely to stick around? You know, these are separate questions, but from a policy perspective, the answer probably points us in different directions. And finally, do immigrants choose institutional completeness over a job? So this is one of the questions that comes to mind for me, based in part from my experience when I was in Alberta. Do people just move around based on jobs and the pursuit of jobs? Or are they interested in the services that accessing services that can be provided to them in their language, in the language that they can speak? So would they be more likely to stick around in, I'll take a New Brunswick example, some part of Acadia, even if they're not perfectly employed? Or are they just going to move to Alberta to find a job anyway? So that last question is the one that I'd like to turn my attention to next, but welcome questions if anyone has any other research ideas. Thank you.